trade, surprise returns and bad starts. This week I'm chatting all about the Spanish Grand Prix, so get ready because you've been summoned to the Steward's office. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Steward's office. I'm Saira and this week we are chatting all about the Spanish Grand Prix. It's the first race of a triple header. It's Spain, Austria and then Britain, so there's a lot going on. It is a packed triple header for the drivers and the teams. And Spain is always a really interesting track to be at. The Circuit de Barcelona-Catalunya was traditionally used as a testing circuit until pretty recently when we've only been going out to Bahrain. But it's a circuit that has high and low speed corners. It tests a lot of the different aspects of the car and the balance, which is why it was such a favoured test track to do. So you really get a good read on how each car is doing overall, not just the ones that are good in high speed or good in low speed, but which teams have really built a car and have a package that will work well overall, right? So a really interesting track to be at, and being the first one in a triple header as well in Europe means that we were going to get a lot of upgrades coming in. But before we start talking about all of that, let's chat about some interesting news that came out at the beginning of this race weekend, and that came from Alpine. Now, I'd seen over on Instagram a couple of the people that I follow had said that we were going to be expecting some big news from Alpine. They didn't say what it was. I don't think a couple of them were sure what it was going to be, but they knew that Alpine was coming out with some news. And now what I think a lot of us ended up thinking this was going to be was that 2025 seat, the seat that Esteban Ocon is vacating at the end of the season. A lot of us thought it was going to be a driver announcement. However, Alpine seemed to still be holding off on that. Instead, what they did announce was that Flavio Briatore will be joining Alpine as an executive advisor. I don't think a lot of people were necessarily expecting that news. And it was news that raised a couple of eyebrows in and around F1. I was very surprised at it. For those of you who don't know, Flavio Briatore was involved in Crashgate a good couple of years ago. We're talking 2008. He was involved in all of that drama and ended up getting a lifetime ban from the FIA because of it. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about when I talk about Crashgate, I do have an entire episode about it. I'll link it in the show notes and in the description of the YouTube video if you guys want to have a listen to that. Essentially, Crashgate was a way that Flavio Briatore was trying to manipulate the World Championship, really. And that's a big no-go. That's not even a grey area in F1 and the FIA. That is just a massive no. And the FIA opted to give him a lifetime ban from Formula One. Now, that did end up being overturned by the French courts not too long after it was actually given to him. So it wasn't that he was banned, and he has been around F1 for a little bit now, yeah? He has been seen at races. He, I think, has ended up as an actual ambassador for Formula One. So he's still been involved, maybe not as much at the forefront as he was when Crashgate had happened, but he has been around, just not necessarily linked to a specific team, and not in the way that he is now linked with Alpine. Now, Alpine have had issues, I think is the best way to say it. They've had problems over the past couple of years. They really aren't performing where they want to be and where they had expected them to be at this point. They had massive plans in place about how many races it was going to take until they would be able to be battling for a championship, and that just really has not materialized. Alpine, especially this year, have been struggling, and I think we've seen it over the past couple of years really that they're not fighting towards the front. There are small glimmers of hope here and there, but it's not been consistent and it's not been amazing, and it's not been them working towards a championship. This year, however, I think we can all admit that it has been awful for the Enstone team. Okay, recently it's been a little bit better, but on a whole it has been bad. They've been struggling to get out of Q1. The car was overweight, vastly overweight at the beginning of the season. The issues that they've had with their drivers, Otmar Zafnauer being fired from the team, I think that was last season now. So issues on track with their personnel, with the car. There's just been no particular aspect of Alpine that has been running smoothly for this team. So they are bringing Briatore in as this executive advisor. I don't think we've really been given a whole load of information about what that means. On the Spanish Grand Prix grid walk, Rachel and Karun were trying to figure out what aspects that he might want to start looking at, what was he really wanting to hone in on, but it just feels a little bit vague to me at the moment. So whether it's just that, yeah, he might not have really started yet, the appointment has happened, but he hasn't had a chance to go into the factory to sort of look at the books and the documents and all of that sort of thing and really get into understanding what is going on with the team and then planning. That could be the case, but there is a lot of work to be done for Alpine, I think. Like I said, on track, off track, personnel, the cars, now they've got to try and find a driver to fill that seat and help them move that team ahead. Whether they pick someone like Jack Doohan or Mick Schumacher or someone completely different, there's a lot of work to be done. And I think what their hope is that Briatore, with all of his years of experience and all of his knowledge, will help them push forward. That, I think, was the main bit of news that came out of this race weekend. I don't think there was a whole load else from what I can remember. I honestly did think the Spanish Grand Prix weekend would be the weekend we would find out where Carlos Sainz was going in 2025. However, we still have no clue. I don't think we've really been given a proper indication about that. Right now, I would definitely say it's got to be between Sauber/Audi and then Williams. Those seem to be the teams that he has been most associated with. Sauber/Audi, I think we've known since Audi announced they wanted to come onto the grid that Carlos Sainz was a target driver for them. Williams, since Canada, have made it more vocally known that they are aiming to try and get Carlos in the team. Carlos this weekend did say that it is something he wants sorted out. It's not something that he wants hanging over his head. But that decision has still not been made as far as we're concerned. Potentially, right, by the time this comes out, I'm filming on a Sunday evening at around 5 p.m. When this is published, we might already know. But as of right now, on a Sunday evening, we still don't know. So that was really it in terms of news. But let's have a chat about upgrades, because we had some teams bringing very big upgrade packages to the Spanish Grand Prix. We'll kick off with Ferrari, who bought 7 different parts to their upgrade package for Barcelona. This was a fairly big upgrade package for the team. I am going to have to look at my list, but they ended up upgrading their rear wing, the coke/engine cover, floor fences, the halo, the diffuser, the floor body, and the floor edge. So there was a lot of work going on there. So this was actually the upgrades package from Ferrari that wasn't actually due until Silverstone, right at the end of the triple header. From the sounds of it, Ferrari had really pushed to get those upgrades out sooner. They managed it. They were hoping it would push them closer to the front of the grid with Red Bull. Red Bull also came in with a couple of upgrades, not as many, but they ended up upgrading the floor body, the rear wing end plate, the beam wing, the side pod inlet, and the coke/engine cover. Aston came in with 3 upgrades. They were upgrading the rear corner, the front suspension, and the front corner. VCARB were a team that brought in 6 upgrades, so it was quite a substantial upgrade package as well. They had the beam wing, the floor body, the rear wing, the side pod inlet, the front corner, and the coke/engine cover. Sauber, very limited upgrades, but they had a new front corner and a new rear wing to debut at Barcelona. And then finally, it was Haas, and all they had upgraded was their rear impact structure. That was 6 out of the 10 teams that opted to bring upgrades to Barcelona. With Ferrari, we know that they really pushed to get those upgrades done ahead of time. So that was 6 out of 10 teams bringing upgrades to their cars, and that's not surprising that it was the majority of teams. It was the first race of a European triple header, and I've said before, with most of the team's bases being in Europe, it's just a lot easier to bring them to a European race. But really was VCARB and Ferrari that had brought the most amount of upgrades at the biggest package on their cars. And you gotta think, when you're bringing that many upgrades, you're hoping for a big boost in performance. It sounds like there is a lot that you might have been able to find with all these parts when you've done the simulations and you've been in the wind tunnel. But that was it for the upgrades. 6 out of 10 of the teams bringing them. But let's have a chat about what went on when those cars and those upgrades actually got out onto the track. Well, free practice wise, not a whole load going on. They were fairly normal, just no drama going on. Did have Ollie Behrman running in free practice 1 in Haas, so that was that, but much else going on. On the topic of Ollie Behrman though, it does sound like we are getting closer and closer to an announcement of Ollie Behrman going to Haas. It sounds like it's pretty much a done deal, everything bar the announcement at this point, and I am curious as to whether that announcement will be made when we head out to Silverstone. Only 2 races away now. Ollie Behrman will be out there with F2 anyway, and it will be his home race, so I am curious as to whether that is when they will announce their driver. But yeah, practice in general, there were 4 teams I think that looked to be quite strong and sort of the usual contenders that you'd expect: Red Bull, McLaren, Ferrari and Mercedes. Now Mercedes actually looked like they'd made a step forward, so they did look like they'd be more in the mix and not sort of just trailing behind everyone else. But yep, the McLaren looking very strong, Ferrari looked okay, Mercedes looking stronger. Red Bull did seem like they were on the back foot a little bit, but I feel like that has been sort of the pattern with them in the last couple of races, where maybe the setup just hasn't switched on straight away. They've not been able to nail the setup from the get-go. So it's taken them a little bit to understand what the correlation between the simulator and their simulations compared to when the cars are on track are, and then working out the setup from there. Going into qualifying though, Logan Sargent ended up being given a 3-place grid penalty for the race because he had impeded Lance Stroll in Q1. We did have double eliminations in Q1 for Williams and VCARB. Now Williams, okay, fair enough, they didn't come in with an upgrades package, and because of everything that happened with their chassis earlier on in the season where it had been broken and cracked, we knew they were going to be on the back foot with their upgrades because time has had to go into building these spare chassis to be used on the cars, and that's also taken money out of some of their upgrades, right? So that, fair enough, I wasn't really expecting them to have the strongest part of the season right now. VCARB, however, with 6 different parts, 6 new upgrades on their car, neither driver managed to make it out of Q1. Yuki and Daniel were both eliminated, so it was not a great qualifying for them. What we did get though were both Sauber drivers get into Q2, and I think that was the first time we've seen it happen this season. We have seen Valtteri Bottas in Q2, we have seen Zhou Guanyu in Q2, but I don't think we've seen both of them in Q2 at the same time. So a slightly more promising sight from them. They did end up eliminated after Q2 though, and I can't lie, I do think Q3 would have been a little bit too much to ask of them, but the fact that both cars got into Q2 I think is still a pretty decent effort. Like I said though, not surprised at Sauber getting eliminated in Q2. What I was surprised at though was both Aston Martins being eliminated. Lance Stroll and Fernando Alonso, neither of them managed to get into Q3. And I am gutted for Fernando Alonso, more so than Lance Stroll right now, because this is Fernando's home race. I was willing both him and Carlos this weekend to have a good race. I love it when the hometown drivers have good home races. It means a lot to them. It means a lot to the crowds. But he got eliminated in Q2, and Aston, just the car has seemed a bit nowhere over the weekend. It hasn't really lit up the timesheets. It hasn't seemed exceptionally fast in both race and quali pace, and in quali pace we definitely saw that. However, at the cost of both Aston Martins not getting out of Q2, we did see both of the Alpines in Q3. And I think, once again, this is the first time we've seen both of them get into Q3, which is incredible for them. And on top of the Alpines, we also saw Sergio Perez getting into that final stage of qualifying. It's been a little bit since we've seen him there, but it was definitely going to be needed for Sergio Perez. I think he knew that he was going to have a good qualifying session because he was facing a 3-place grid penalty that had carried over from the Canadian Grand Prix after he had driven the car in an unsafe manner, the whole rear wing hanging off the back of his car, driving into the pit lane. So he was carrying that forward from Canada, so he needed a good qualifying session. So getting into Q3 was something that he really, really needed. Lando Norris did take pole position for the Spanish Grand Prix, and this has only been his second pole position in his career. For some reason, I thought he had more. Not like a whole load, but I thought he had 3 or 4, but I might be thinking about sprint races potentially. But yeah, this is his second career pole. First one was Sochi 2021 and now Spain 2024. He had a phenomenal lap. After him was Max Verstappen, and then, kind of surprisingly for me, it was both Mercedes drivers. Lewis Hamilton in P3, George Russell in P4. Look, I know I said that the cars looked stronger throughout practice, and yes, we had Lewis Hamilton top in the timesheets, I think, in free practice too, but I wasn't actually expecting them to do this well in qualifying. Slightly surprised the Ferraris didn't manage to break into the top 3. They locked out the 3rd row, which still isn't bad, but I did think they'd be slightly higher up on the grid. Let's have a chat about the race though, and look, this was not as exciting for me as Canada was. I really, really enjoyed the Canadian Grand Prix. There was so much going on. Spain, it didn't feel as exciting. It wasn't an awful race, but it wasn't brilliant, in my opinion anyway. It wasn't the best race that we've had, but it did have some interesting moments. I will give it that. It wasn't completely, dull with nothing going on. There were some moments, but I think what can be said is that this really wasn't a great weekend overall for both Fernando Alonso and Carlos Sainz. Neither of them had the best home race. This wasn't the race that any of them were going to be hoping for. I think, for Carlos, especially with the Ferrari, I had been hoping that he would have been on the podium. I don't think the car was strong enough necessarily to battle for a race win, but going into the weekend I thought maybe a podium is possible. With Fernando Alonso, I was just hoping he would get into the points, especially after the Q2 elimination, but this just wasn't a great race for either driver for their home race. The start of the race really was not what I was expecting to see it happen. Lando Norris did not get a great start. It wasn't brilliant. He didn't get off the line very well. And Lewis Hamilton in P3 also really did not have a great start. So both of them were on the back foot. And you would think with Lando having a bad start, maybe Max Verstappen can then capitalise on that and get into P1. But it wasn't him. He actually ended up on the road a little bit because Lando Norris had squeezed him off track. It was actually George Russell that managed to take the race lead. And it was epic. He was definitely aware of what was going on around him, reading the racetrack very well, and just took a dive into turn 1 and took the lead. We saw Lando Norris getting bumped down into P3, and then I think for Lewis Hamilton he was in P4 or P5, so the bad starts did cost both of those drivers some places. What else happened during this race though? Well, Fernando Alonso, yes, he ended up taking the escape road, I think, during lap 1. I'm not entirely sure what happened, whether he made contact or not, but he did have a moment off the racetrack, and on lap 9 he had gone from P10 where he had started down to P14. I can't tell whether he had sustained damage or not, but yeah, his race start I think really wrecked the race for him. Kevin Magnussen had a 5-second time penalty for a false start, and I don't think we were actually shown the replay. If we were, maybe I was looking at the data or something, but yeah, he ended up getting a 5-second time penalty for a false start. Hülkenberg and Tsunoda both got 5-second time penalties for speeding in the pit lane, and I feel like it's been a little while since we've had multiple drivers end up with penalties for speeding in this pit lane. Hülkenberg and Tsunoda also got penalties, 5 seconds each for speeding in the pit lane. But I think those are the only penalties that we had during the race. As far as I can tell, right now, we've had no post-race penalties be applied to anyone. Fingers crossed that stays that way before this comes out. What I did find interesting about this race, though, was the fact that we had 9 drivers being lapped. And I get that this is one of our shorter circuits that we go to, but the fact that it was nearly half of the grid that got lapped is insane to me. And those 9 people were Alonso, Zhou, Stroll, Ricciardo, Bottas, Magnussen, Albon, Tsunoda and Sargent. I can't lie though, to see both Aston Martins being lapped, and yeah, you know what, even the VCARBs, who've had a fairly strong season so far, I really wasn't expecting that, but I think you can tell that this really was a track that a lot of the teams struggled on. And it does kind of go back to me saying like, yeah, this is a circuit that has such a good mixture of corners and everything that you can really tell when a car is heavily relying on a circuit to be high-speed corners or low-speed corners. And 9 cars to be lapped though just seems insane to me. But who ended up being in our top 10 for the Spanish Grand Prix? Well, it was Max Verstappen that did win. However, not a sure thing that he was going to win this race. Wasn't running into the sunset for it. There were overtakes and strategy that really had to come into play here for him. In P2 was Lando Norris. Lewis Hamilton rounded out that podium with his first podium of the season. Then it was Russell, Leclerc, Sainz, Piastri, Perez, Gasly, and then Ocon. So double Alpine points, which once again, not expecting that. Let's dive into each of the teams. So let's have a chat about how they did. Kicking off with the constructors leaders right now. I was going to say champions, but we haven't decided that just yet. But starting off with Red Bull. Now, I was going to say it's been a bit more of a difficult weekend for them compared to, you know, when it's been more of a dominant weekend. But I think that's sort of been the pattern over the last couple of races, where it's not come as easily to them when they've hit the track on a Friday for free practice. They're not, you know, just setting all the times right at the top of the timesheet, everything going smoothly for them. The last, I would say 2, maybe 3 races, it's been a bit more difficult. They are battling to find out, like I said, what setups they need, how to treat the tyres. We've seen understeer on the cars, we've seen oversteer on the cars, we've heard Max and Sergio complain about the balance of the cars. So it's not been straightforward for them, and Spain was the same. They didn't get off to a flying start here. There was a lot they needed to do to dial in that car. And even when they did that, they couldn't get pole position with Max Verstappen in qualifying, or Sergio Perez for that matter. And this was a win. Like I said, it wasn't assured for them. It wasn't an easy win for them to get. Max and the strategy team and his race engineer really had to work and put a lot of effort into this. And that's not saying that he didn't put the effort into his other wins, but it just wasn't as easy. He wasn't able to build up a really nice lead at the front and then just fly away with it and sort of be able to manage the speed that he wanted the entire race. It wasn't the sort of race where Max has been in P1 from that one to the checkered flag. There was a lot that had to go into this win. He had to make sure, you know, he wasn't using up too much of his tyres. The strategy had to be correct. The tyre selection, the actual pit stop times had to be right, and where Red Bull were planning to feed him back when he was getting into the race. So at what point were you going to pit him? And especially against Lando Norris, they had to really calculate and figure out what to do there. And I think it's so easy if you haven't been watching the races, right? You might see the notification that Max Verstappen has won the Spanish Grand Prix, and it's so easy to think, right, same old story as usual. And I also would not blame you for thinking that, but this wasn't the same old story for usual. And it hasn't been for the last couple of wins that he's had. It's been a little bit more work for him, but you could tell on the podium, you know, he was grinning. He was so happy. And I don't think it's the same when he wins by like a 30-40 second margin. And don't get me wrong, it's got to be nice, yeah, as a race car driver, when you know that the win is there, you know that you can do it, you know you're going to fly with it. That has got to be a nice feeling, because it's also got to be a little less stressful. But it also must get a little bit tiring at times, because you're race car drivers. You have grown up karting and, you know, racing through all the different series and in Formula One, battling against other people. And so you've got to miss that. It's like, yeah, every so often it's nice to have an easier win, but you want to be able to overtake people and work for it as well. Don't get me wrong, I think every single driver on that grid would love a dominant car. would love to just know that they've got the fastest car on the grid. But I do believe it does get to a point sometimes where you kind of do miss that wheel-to-wheel racing, right? And I think seeing that look on Max's face, seeing how happy he looked, it's just that sense of satisfaction, I think, when you know, okay, maybe the car wasn't perfect, maybe it wasn't exactly what we needed, and there's a lot more work to be done, but you worked in harmony with your team and with your car to get this race win, and he looked absolutely chuffed on the podium. Also, his overtake on George Russell, I think it was on lap 2 or lap 3, it was very, very early on in the race. It was so beautiful to watch, such beautiful racing. Absolutely loved seeing that. Sergio Perez, on the other hand, had a bit more of a struggle this weekend, and I think that was going to be the case with a 3-place grid penalty because there's a lot more work you're having to do. He ended up with that 3-place grid penalty starting in P11, so immediately outside of the points. It wasn't an awful weekend, right? It wasn't like he didn't come home with points. I think the one thing him and the team can take away from this is the fact that he's taking home points and not another penalty. And a fairly clean race for him, no major incidents or anything like that. However, I think it's just that sort of story that we've said with Sergio, where he needs to find the form that he had at the beginning of the year, both for himself and for the team with the Constructors' Championship. I don't know whether it's potentially a mindset thing with him or whether it is the fact that he's trying to just get used to the upgrades that Red Bull have brought over the last couple of races. But yeah, it would love to see, especially with the way McLaren are progressing. We're seeing Ferrari and Mercedes battling up there as well. It would be great to see Sergio Perez join in with that battle with those drivers, but we aren't getting that right now. Moving on to Ferrari though, 7 upgrades on the car and it just didn't seem to do much for them, right? It didn't bring them closer to Red Bull or to McLaren. It didn't help them get into that battle for the front. Like I mentioned before, qualifying, not great for them. And the race, fairly quiet, not a whole lot going on. We did have, though, Carlos complaining about an overtake that Lewis had done. They did make contact. There was a little carbon fibre that came off. I think Carlos was of the belief that Lewis had pushed him off track and gained an advantage by doing that. It did get referred up to Stewards, and Steward said no further action. I mean, for me personally, I don't necessarily think there was anything there to give a penalty for. Carlos did feel otherwise. But I think that was probably the most adventurous part of the race for Ferrari, other than the battle that both of them had against each other at the beginning. And I think at that point it was a telltale sign of how this race was going to go for Ferrari. There wasn't anyone else to battle. They were just battling each other. And I think, yeah, that was a really big indicator of how this race was going to go, because they didn't have quality pace and they did not have the race pace either. 7 upgrades on a track like Barcelona you would think would help them pull close to the front, battling with a couple of cars at least, but they just seemed to be in their own bubble where it was just the 2 Ferraris on track. Now, don't get me wrong, they ended up coming home with P5 for Charles Leclerc and P6 for Carlos Sainz, and like I said, I'm gutted for Carlos. I would love to see him on a podium at his home race. But the results in and of itself aren't bad for the team. However, with the way McLaren are progressing, with the way Lando Norris is driving this season, there is a good chance that P2 in the Constructors is going to be at risk for them if they can't figure out what to do with the car, if they can't figure out how to make these upgrades work and how to get that quality and race pace back in the car. But let's move on to McLaren, who do look like they are a vastly stronger and quicker team, especially when you compare it to their form at the beginning of the season. They look stronger, they look quicker, they look like they can really go toe-to-toe with Red Bull in qualifying and in the race. And this has been a consistent thing from McLaren now for a couple of races. They are a team that have honestly made me so excited for this season, because the way they've brought their upgrades, the way they've progressed, and the way we're seeing, in particular, Lando Norris drive at the moment, gives me a lot of hope that there's going to be so much more battling at the front of the field. Even if it does just end up being between him and Max for the rest of the season, we have a battle going on at the front. It makes it exciting. It makes going into a race weekend unknown. You don't know whether Max is going to be able to get the win. You don't know how well McLaren are going to do to sort of bring in their car and get Lando and Oscar closer to the front, battling for pole position, battling for race wins and podiums. They have made me so excited for the rest of the season. Yes, I do think there was a very, very good chance Lando could have won, and that not great start at the beginning of the race, it put him on the back foot, because what ended up happening was that Max Verstappen could very quickly, within a lap or two, overtake George Russell for the lead. Lando spent another couple of laps behind George Russell, though, couldn't get that overtaken for a little bit, and that did cost him. And he has been very hard on himself in the interviews. You can see that he is gutted, because he knows that the car is there. It's at a speed where they could win. And he also knows that he has the skill to win. He's won a Grand Prix, and I genuinely think there was every chance that he could have won the race in Spain. However, yes, a bad start did mean that he was on the back foot, and it was going to take probably a lot of work to get there. And it didn't happen. He did take home P2. And look, I don't think that is a bad result at all, because he took P2, driver of the day, and the fastest lap, right? So he's got one extra point for fastest lap. He's moved up to P2 in the Drivers' Championship ahead of Charles Leclerc. And I think that's really where we're going to see the battle for P2. I think Max Verstappen at this point is a shoo-in for Drivers' Championship. He's going to be the champion for another year, but I think we will see that battle from P2 and downwards now. So the result itself isn't bad, but he's disappointed because he knows he's capable of more. He knows what the car is capable of, and he knows that it was possible out in Spain. It just wasn't meant to be, though, it just wasn't meant to happen. But Austria, which is the next race out now, is a track that he goes very, very well at. It's a track that Lando really enjoys, and he also does very well at. I think McLaren as a whole traditionally do quite well out here. And then it's his home race. It's the British Grand Prix. And he knows he has such a good fan base that come out to watch him in Britain. I definitely believe that he will be winning more races this season. It isn't just that one race at Miami that he'll walk away with as a win this season. We will see more. Where those circuits are, I couldn't tell you, but I have no doubt that he will be walking away with a good couple of wins this season. I would say at least another 3 or 4 races. Like I said, the car is there. He as a driver is in such a better headspace, I think, especially after the win in Miami. The commentators are talking about the maturity that he has really shown and the growth that he's shown this season, and that is evident in the way that he's racing now. Things just don't always pan out your way, I think, is the thing. Motorsport and sport in general, sometimes there are things that are out of your control. The bad start, yes, it's something that he will look back at and try and figure out why it happened. But it's those moments that you have to learn from. You've got to take those things on the chin, go back, read the data, analyse it, figure out what you could have done better, learn what you could have done better and apply it to the next race. There's nothing else that he can do at this point, but P2 is still a very, very strong result for Lando. Oscar Piastri, on the other hand, look, it was a bit more of a difficult race for him. He had to abort his fast lap in Q3 because he went into the gravel, and it does start you on the back foot when you're starting that far back on the grid. I say that far back, but you're not in the top 5. There's a lot more work you need to do that. So I think this weekend was always going to be a little bit of a struggle for him. Finished in P7, which I think is still a decent result, but like I said, I think the weekend was going to be a struggle after qualifying. Didn't go well for him. Moving on to Mercedes, and this is a team that had a much, much stronger and improved weekend. They really do look like they're slowly and steadily improving. They're building on their performances. They're understanding the car better, the concept, the parts, the upgrades. They're really slowly and steadily making that sort of step up that they really, really needed to. George did go on to hard tyres for his last stint of the race. That was not something that paid off. He wasn't happy with the tyres. I don't think they were firing up the way that he or the team were expecting them to. Lewis went on to soft tyres, and they were a used pair of softs, and they seemed to be working much, much better for him. Stuff like that, though, is just, yeah, you're not going to really know until you get onto them, because I think Bernie Collins was saying there wasn't a lot of data on the hard tyre anyway, so it was going to be a risk to go out there. He was one of the only front runners that got onto the hard tyres on there with the Carlos Sainz, I think. So yeah, there is that risk because you don't have that much data on it. It didn't work out, but he still took home P4. Lewis Hamilton on used soft tyres took home P3, and that is his first podium of the season. His 198th career podium. Could he potentially get to 200 this season? I mean, we have 14 races left. There is a chance because, like I said, Mercedes do look like they're slowly improving, but we will wait and see. On a whole, though, this just seems like a team that have figured out what was going so badly wrong with their car, and it looks like there's a clear path forward for them. Now, I don't know how much that is going to bring them within the times that Red Bull and McLaren are setting, because out in Spain, like I said, it did seem stronger, but they're really still not at the pace that Red Bull are setting and that Lando Norris and the McLaren is setting currently, right? So we will wait and see. They weren't a team that brought an upgrade to Barcelona. What they did do is bring a new floor, but that was simply to reduce the weight of the car. By the sounds of it, it wasn't necessarily an upgrade. They hadn't changed anything else bar making it lighter. The new nose came out in Canada, and was it Monaco before Canada, I think? Yeah, so that's when the new front nose and the new front wing came in, but no big upgrade package out in Barcelona like the likes of Ferrari and VCARB, so potentially we could see one before summer break. James Allison was saying that they sound like they figured out what's gone on. He said it was one of those things when they realised, where he was like, how could we have been so stupid as to not have seen this before and not have figured out this was the problem, basically. So it sounds like they know what's going on, and I think that is now going to help them with the upgrades package that they plan to bring over the next couple of races. I don't know when, but you know what the team's like. They'll just bring parts. It might not be in one fell swoop like some of the other teams have done. It might just be a nose here, a rear wing there, bit of suspension here. But I think it's just put them in a better mindset and has given them a better direction now. What I'm really curious with Mercedes, what the rest of this triple header is going to look like for them, though, whether it's just Barcelona that they could do well at, or whether we're going to see those strengths when they go out to Austria and to Silverstone. Moving on to Aston Martin, and this was a very disappointing race for them. I think, there wasn't a whole load that went on for them in general. Fernando Alonso having that sort of off moment in lap 1, and I don't know whether he picked up damage or not, but it didn't seem great from that point. He was just losing places. The speed didn't seem to be there. Lance Stroll not really able to do much with the car either. It was a really disappointing race for them, and like I said, in particular for Fernando Alonso, home race, no points, and was one of the 9 cars that were lapped. It's crazy to think because they were P2 coming into the Spanish Grand Prix in 2023, and this year they're just a solid P5. And they took no points home from Spain, no extra points for them. More so than Aston Martin, though, I think VCARB had a particularly disappointing race with, once again, like Ferrari, that many upgrades on the car, and it just didn't seem to make an impact. Now, Laurent Mekies and VCARB are saying that they were using the Spanish Grand Prix to be able to understand what their upgrades were going to do and how they were going to behave and how to optimize them and everything, ready for the rest of the triple header. Now, that may very well be true, but I don't think they necessarily wanted these cars to be finishing so far back, so far out of the points to not get into Q2. I mean, this was not a good weekend for them. I have my fingers crossed that Austria next week will be better for them. Next week, by the time this comes out, it'll be in a couple of days. But you get what I mean. I have my fingers crossed that Austria will be a much better track for them, that there'll be more performance in those upgrades. We will wait and see that and see what happens, but it was just really not a great show for them. And I do think for VCARB at this point, it feels quite uncharacteristic that they would qualify this badly and that they would finish in the race this far behind the points, because they've shown that they can have a very strong car, but these upgrades are just not exactly working for them currently. Alpine, probably the surprise of the Spanish Grand Prix. Both cars getting into Q3, both cars getting in the points. Flavio Briatore back in the paddock with Alpine. No war between the drivers. I mean, what is going on at Alpine? Just a massive surprise. I don't think anyone was necessarily expecting a double Q3 and double points from the team. Whether or not this is something that carries on, I really don't know. I'm going to be very, very curious. I think since they've been able to sort of drop some of the weight from the car, it's definitely helped them. I'm just curious to see how the rest of this season goes for them. And okay, maybe not season, but definitely the rest of the triple header and in the run up to summer break now. Haas, fairly quiet-ish race. Both of the drivers got penalties, both for different things. No points for them either. I mean, it wasn't the most exciting race for Haas, I think. They weren't far off the points though, but it just didn't materialise. They weren't able to get the overtakes in to get into the points. Williams also having a fairly quiet weekend, eliminated in Q1. Alex Albon did have a moment off track where he went into the gravel and got on the radio and was just like, what in the world happened to the car? Really not sure what happened then. Yeah, by the sounds of it, it was just something that he felt wasn't quite right with the car. Logan Sargent finished in P20. Again, he was, I think, 16 seconds behind Yuki Tsunoda, who finished in P19, and 26-ish seconds behind his teammate Alex Albon. It's not looking great for him. And at this point, I think Williams, and I've said it before in previous episodes, I definitely think they've made their mind up right now. For whatever reason, Logan is just struggling to get the performance in. And like I said, I'm not expecting him to get into the points. The Williams car this season so far has not been great, but all Williams have really wanted is to see him get closer to his teammate Alex Albon, but you know, to be around 26 seconds. I don't know whether something happened there. I don't know whether it was a late pit stop, because they didn't really show a lot of Logan Sargent's race. To be fair, they didn't really show a lot of the back markers because there was so much going on at the front with Lando and Max and Charles and George and Lewis and everything going on at the front. There was a lot this race. They didn't really show us a lot of what was going on at the back. And then finally, Sauber, who, you know, had a very, very good qualifying, considering both drivers got into Q2, but are still the only team without points and are currently in P10 in the Constructors. And that's about it for them. I think, like a lot of the back marker teams, it has been a lot quieter. What I will say, though, is that we had some amazing, amazing overtakes at the Spanish Grand Prix. One of my absolute favourites had to be that battle between George and Lando Norris. They were side by side for so long. It was clean racing, no contact being made. And it was a lot of back and forth, but it was really beautiful overtaking to see. And I think that's what we get a lot of out at the Circuit de Barcelona, Catalunya, is amazing overtaking opportunities for the drivers. So that was really, really good to see. Lewis Hamilton had some beautiful overtakes, Carlos Sainz and George Russell, the two that really stick out to me. And we also had some amazing battles on track. You know, especially towards the end of the race, the two that, you know, I think everyone was keeping an eye on were Lando Norris and Max Verstappen. Was Lando going to make up that time deficit and manage to catch Max? And then there was the battle for P4 with George Russell and Charles Leclerc, because Charles, with the soft tyres, like Lewis Hamilton, was rapidly catching up to George. And I think on the last lap got within DRS, and it just wasn't enough. So not my most exciting of races, right? But there were pockets that were really, really fun to watch. And it was racing that gave me hope that the rest of this season we're going to keep seeing closer racing. We're going to get there. We're going to see these cars start to slowly, slightly get closer together with the sort of speed deficits and lap time deficits. And it's not going to be as big as what we saw in the previous season and at the start of the season. Now, Lando Norris did get driver of the day. I think I would either pick Lewis Hamilton for driver of the day, or You know what? I'm going for Lewis Hamilton for my driver of the day. I really, really enjoyed seeing the overtakes that he made during this race. I think for a used set of soft tyres to be setting the times that he did to get past, I think it was Carlos and George, and then build up a nice gap between him and George. Yep, I think Lewis Hamilton is my driver of the day, but Lando also drove an incredibly good race. So that was the Spanish Grand Prix, the first of our triple header, and by the time we get to summer break, we would have done 5 races in 6 weeks, and that is a lot of races in a short amount of time. But next up is the Austrian Grand Prix. It's the home race for Red Bull Racing, and then we go out to the British GP. That is going to be the home race for a couple of teams as well as Lewis Hamilton, Lando Norris and George Russell. It's going to be a packed couple of weeks, guys. Races and teams and upgrades and hopefully some silly season news, but we might have to wait until after the summer break to figure out what more the 2025 grid is going to look like. So a lot going on, but it looks very promising in terms of battles for wins and just battling for position up and down the field. Thank you guys so much for listening, and diolch yn fawr. Make sure you follow me on Instagram and TikTok, especially over the next couple of weeks with all the races, because I'll be posting a lot more information and news and analysis on my social media channels at stewards_office, and I will see you guys the next time you're summoned to the Stewards office.